Good morning. Welcome to the Los Angeles World Affairs Council and Town Hall. I am Kim McClary, President and CEO. We hope you all had a nice holiday break, and we are so very happy to be back with you. The staff and I would also like to thank you all profusely for all of your ongoing support. In light of yesterday's extraordinary, distressing, and unprecedented events, we are especially grateful that we have this unique and special forum where we can all come together to process information, ask critical questions, share our concerns, and try to make sense of events that are significantly impacting our world. In response to yesterday's events, today's program will focus on the political impact of those actions, both short-term and long-term, while also integrating the topics that Dan had originally planned for today's discussion. Just as a reminder, after each of these programs, we email you a survey where you can provide us feedback on the specific program that you just saw, as well as give your ideas for future topics and programs. So please continue to send us your comments so that we can provide you with the most timely, compelling, and relevant programming that meets your high expectations. We understandably have a huge audience on today's program. We anticipate that you all will have many questions for Dan. Please type them into the control panel on the right-hand side of your screen. You can do this at any time. Jessica will do her best to get to as many of your questions as possible. Dan, we are so grateful that we have this program with you today. Let me turn this over to you quickly so that you can get started to frame today's discussion as well as the topics that you'll be covering. Thank you so much.
Kim, thank you so much. And thanks to all of you for joining us for our first program of 2021. I know that 2020 was a very challenging, very difficult, often wrenching year for many of us. And I want to wish all of you a much better, a much happier, a much nicer 2021. When Kim and I and the team, Claire and Jessica and the rest of the amazing group they have here at LA World Affairs Council Town Hall decided that began planning our 2021 programming, the original thought was that we'd wait until next week to start. This is the first week that the staff is back at work and they have a lot to do to get ready for all the other incredible programs that they put on for you every week throughout the year. And so originally we thought, well, we'll start on the second Thursday of January. We'll start on January 14th. After all, how much can happen in the first few days of a new year? And then we got to thinking about it, and the staff, Jessica and Claire, made it very clear that no matter how, given all the work they have to do, given that this is their first few days back, that they recognize the importance of the Georgia election that we saw on Tuesday. They recognized in advance the import of yesterday, even though none of us could have predicted the unprecedented events that we all witnessed. And they volunteered. And they said, this program is an important one to us. We know it's important to our members and to our viewers and our listeners. And so I try to take time if not every week, almost every week, to thank not just Kim, but Jessica, Claire, the entire team at LA World Affairs Council Town Hall. But just know that today's program is something that they're doing above and beyond the call of duty, because this program means so much to them and it means so much to me. And we know that it means a great deal to all of you. That said, none of us knew when we made the plans to start this week exactly how seminal the events of the first full week of January would turn out to be, not just in American politics, but in America. And some of you, those of you who joined these programs last year regularly, you know that I am an independent. I'm a registered no party preference voter in California, and I do my best every week. I'll do my best today, and I'll do it throughout 2021 to be as balanced as possible, to be as even-handed as possible, And if you feel like I know many of you do, if you feel that I'm occasionally taking one side or the other, I'd ask that you give me a little bit of patience and know that even if one of my comments sounds like it's leaning a little bit left, a little bit right, that over the course of an hour, or over the course of a week, or over the course of a year, with any luck, will balance off to the greatest degree possible. For those of you who've known me outside of LA World Affairs Council Town Hall, many of you know that before I got involved, before I became an independent, I worked for many years in Republican politics. And while I do my best to leave that at the door when I join all of you each week, every once in a while I will draw from my experience in politics when I'm talking about the topics. Please know that when I begin today's program by quoting Ronald Reagan, it's not as a partisan, either current or former, but just to draw a quote from a former American leader that I think is particularly relevant given the events of the last 24 hours and the events of the last several years. President Ronald Reagan, as many of you know, is famous for having said the following. He said, "Freedom is a fragile thing and is never more than one generation away from extinction." And I think yesterday was an important reminder to us at how fragile our democracy is. And while the events, not just of the last 4 years, but the last several years, led us to what is certainly an unprecedented, but might have been an inevitable set of incredible and incredibly disturbing occurrences, I think it was also a good reminder for all of us that our democracy, our freedom, is a fragile one. And it's really easy, being 240 plus years removed from the birth of this country, to sort of take those statements for granted. They're cliches, they're bromides, just roll our eyes and go on. But yesterday reminded us how precarious this all is, and how much obligation there is for all of us to do our part, even when we're angry, even when we're upset, even when we're even we're in despair at the comments or actions of those with whom we disagree. That we do have a responsibility to maintain, and at least in this case now, to rebuild this democracy. My own feelings watching the events yesterday is that the Capitol under attack was a metaphor for the challenges our democracy has been facing. As I said a moment ago, the democracy is more fragile than we thought. It's more vulnerable than we thought. Just like the United States Capitol was more vulnerable than we would have expected. But even given the horrifying, the wrenching events of yesterday, the Capitol survived. And our democracy, with all of your participation, will too. But the Capitol, like our democracy, is going to need to be rebuilt. It's going to need to be repaired. And we don't yet know how much damage was done either to the building itself or to the principles it represents. And to me, that's what makes these next chapters in the American story such important ones. And over the course of 2021, through next week and the week after, through the inauguration of a new president, through President Biden's first 100 days in office and beyond, let's commit to each other that even while each week we talk about pressing and urgent news of the day and of the week, let's agree that we're going to remember that our democracy is a lot more fragile than we might have thought it was. And even as we disagree on matters of tremendous public policy and legislative import, that it's on all of us to do everything we can to rebuild and to repair it. Now, what happened yesterday wasn't the first time. It wasn't the first time that the U.S. Capitol has been the target of violence. This has happened before. In 1954, Puerto Rican nationalists opened fire from a House gallery, and they injured 5 members of the House of Representatives with gunfire who were on the floor below. In 1971, there was a bomb planted by a radical left-wing group that exploded, although thankfully no one was harmed. In 1998, a gunman opened fire and he killed 2 Capitol police officers. So this has happened before. But as all of you know, the last time a mob overran the ultimate symbol of American freedom was back in the War of 1812, when the British set fire to the Capitol. And so, like so many of the challenges we talk about each week, while this one wasn't unprecedented completely, it was unusual enough for us to stop and take some stock before we go on with our weekly conversation. So yesterday wasn't the first time that the Capitol was attacked, but it does represent the first time in U.S. history that a president of the United States rejected the peaceful transfer of power. Ever since John Adams, having lost his reelection campaign to Thomas Jefferson in 1801, regardless of the strife involved, we've seen peaceful transfers of power. And that tragically is no longer the case. Karl von Clausewitz, the German philosopher and military strategist, once said, "War is a continuation of politics by other means." And so all of my own opinions as to whether yesterday represented war or terrorism or other types of violence, I have my own opinions, and perhaps we can talk about those later when we get to all of your questions and comments. But if you take that Clausewitz quote, what we saw yesterday, whether you would refer to it as war or terrorism or some other type of violence, is that violence was a continuation of politics by other means, a political system that we've managed to create over the last several years, in which people with whom we don't agree are stupid or evil or an actual threat to democracy. And with any luck, and it'll take a considerable amount of luck, it's in our best interest, I would argue, to step back and realize that those who disagree with us, and there are fringes, the men and women who storm the Capitol are not the kind of people with whom I care to engage in rational political conversation, and I suspect many of you would agree with me. But I think that they are unrepresentative of the 48% of the American public that voted for Donald Trump in all sorts of ways. And if we are going to stitch this democracy back together, we're going to have to find a way to talk to people, not who resort to violence to express their beliefs, but to the much, much larger plurality of the American public who disagree with us and express their disagreement in less violent ways. Joe Biden yesterday gave a remarkable speech, and it's worth noting that he gave that speech before the President of the United States addressed the nation. And it's worth noting that the President-elect urged President Trump to talk to the people. And it's worth noting that shortly after Biden made that request, that President Trump did comply with a short video that he posted on his then Twitter account. But Biden, even in the middle of these very, very difficult, very, very frustrating, horrific sets of occurrences that we witnessed yesterday, Biden, I noticed, maintained an optimism that we've seen throughout the campaign and seen throughout the transition, in which he has consistently talked about, his words, that the better angels of America, in his words, on both sides of the aisle, are going to find a way to overcome this. So for those of you who are newer to our program, every once in a while I actually stop talking and ask all of you your opinion. And thanks to Claire, we post poll questions for you guys to consider. So I'm going to ask you to tell us whether you agree with the optimism that Joe Biden expressed yesterday in his speech to the country. He said, "This is not who we are." And so the first question, a little bit more straightforward than the ones I normally give to you. I'm just curious as to whether you agree with him or not. Is what we saw yesterday something that is worse, something that's beneath than what the American people represent? Is Biden right? Or alternatively, is he wrong? Is this what we've become? and in a hyperpolarized, extraordinarily divisive era is what we saw yesterday, not less than who we are, but is it who we are as an American people, and redoubling the importance of working together to move forward. Claire, what does our group think? Well, I'm very, very heartened by the response. 77% of you, more than 3/4, agree with President-elect Biden that this is not who we are. We are something better than this. And that gives me a huge amount of hope going forward, that if 3/4 of you believe that we're better than that, that's the foundation from which we can make those efforts going forward. Now, of course, in addition to the votes that were cast in the House and Senate yesterday, and I know we'll talk about those when we get to your questions in just a little bit. Over the course of the evening and overnight and tomorrow morning, to this morning, I don't know yet what's going to happen tomorrow morning, I'll have to admit. But over the course of yesterday afternoon, over the course of last night, over the course of this morning, we've seen an absolutely incredible reaction to President Trump's conduct throughout yesterday's violence. We've seen any number of leading political figures in both parties, not just Democrat, but Republican as well, talking about the potential for impeaching him and realizing that even though there's only 13 days left in his term, many people believe on both sides of the aisle that his actions and his inactions and his statements of yesterday demand his removal from office. Others have called for Vice President Pence to invoke the 25th Amendment. And for those of you who are not familiar with the 25th Amendment, a day ago, I'm sure you are now, the fact that a sitting president can be removed from office by a majority vote of his cabinet. And even if, under these very unusual circumstances, many Democrats were calling for impeachment of the 25th Amendment, I think it would be worth a conversation. But many could dismiss that as partisan politics as usual. But we're hearing Republicans, we're hearing conservatives, including at least one Republican member of Congress, talking about the potential for taking these steps. And these are people who agreed with Donald Trump more often than not on matters of public policy over the last 4 years. They agreed with him on taxes. They agreed with him on his approach to China. They agreed with him on other domestic and foreign policy challenges. But what we're hearing now from not just Democrats, but Republicans, not just liberals, but conservatives, is a number of people who believe that the United States might be compromised in its ability to take on challenges that we face between now and noon on January 20th. And the Washington Post reported this morning that any number of prominent Republicans and prominent conservative leaders have been calling White House staff. They've been calling Robert O'Brien, the National Security Advisor, have been calling the White House counsel and others, asking them to stay on the job until January 20th. And even though any number of Trump administration staff and officials have resigned over the last day, including less than an hour ago, the Secretary of Transportation, Elaine Chao, apparently a number of conservatives are calling into the White House saying, you need to stay in order to see this through so we can get to January 20th. So impeachment, of course, the president has already been impeached, but was ultimately not removed from office. And while 13 days is not a lot of time, the Constitution does not set a time frame for impeachment, and the 25th Amendment is something that could be enacted even more quickly. So question number 2 that I'd like to put to all of you, and Claire, if we can put this up on the screen, is what do you think? Do you believe Donald Trump will still be in office on the morning of January 20th? Yes, option 1, yes, he'll complete his term. 2, no, he'll be removed by the 25th Amendment or impeachment. Or the third option, he will be impeached, but not removed from office, presumably because there either is not time or the will in the United States Senate to formally remove him. So let's see what all of you think about what the next 13 days holds for the president. 68%, a little bit over 2/3, say, well, he will complete his term. 20% say he will be removed from office in the next 13 days between now and the morning of January 20th. And a slightly smaller number, 12%, believe the impeachment will take place, but the Senate will not follow up and remove him for whatever the reason. Had we done this webinar, this first webinar earlier in the week, it might have been interesting to ask that question on Tuesday as opposed to Thursday to see how much the numbers had changed. But I will tell you that as tumultuous as the last several weeks and as the last 4 years have been, the fact that 1/3 of a group such as us is saying that they do not believe the president will finish his term unencumbered really is a remarkable statement right there. And so I'm very, very eager to hear your further thoughts on this and other issues when we get to your questions in just a few more minutes. The last thing I want to talk about in this regard, because our webinar, of course, is titled Politics in the Time of Coronavirus, is I think it's worth noting that the events of yesterday, at least in my opinion, will have a profound effect on American politics in any number of ways, most specifically on Joe Biden's ability to develop bipartisan cooperation. Though I've seen a lot of commentary over the last day, or since last night and this morning, about the fact that the majority of Republicans, even after yesterday's violence, still voted to challenge the Electoral College results. But there's another way of looking at it. And I know that some of you, through emails in between our programs, like to give me a hard time for being such an optimist. But in this case, I do look at the glass as somewhat half full. More specifically, I look at the glass as about 40% full, because roughly 40% of the House of Republicans in the House of Representatives last night, early this morning, voted against the two challenges on Arizona's and Pennsylvania's electoral votes. And while, like many of you, whether you happen to be Democrat or Republican, my guess is the overwhelming majority of us would much rather see all or almost all Republicans have voted against the challenge. The fact that 40% did, to me, actually provides a pretty decent amount of hope that these are elected representatives who, even though they are obviously more conservative than Joe Biden ideologically, were willing to put aside party allegiances and vote to confirm the electoral colleges, the electoral votes when put before them. And if Biden can work, at least theoretically, with 40% of the Republicans in the House of Representatives, not on every issue, not on most issues, but even on some issues, that actually does lay the groundwork for some potential bipartisan agreement. Now, we talked about this last year in November and December after the election, whether Biden or McConnell would be able to work together. The dynamic there is obviously dramatically changed given the events of Georgia and Tuesday, which we'll talk about in just one moment. But before we do, I guess I'd like to ask you that question. Given the events of yesterday, not the events of the last 2 months, but just of yesterday, do you think yesterday's violence will make Biden's first months in office easier or harder? Will it be easier because some Republicans will want to distance themselves from Trump's actions? Will it be harder because Biden will find too many Republicans digging in even deeper in even a more polarized and partisan environment? Or third, will it not make any difference at all? So let's see what all of you think before we go on to our next topic. Well, I find that even more encouraging than your answer to the last question, or than your answer to the first question, when you agreed with Joe Biden that the American people are better than what we saw yesterday. The events of yesterday, of course, were horrible. It was, as Senator Schumer correctly referenced, it was a day that will live in infamy. But if there's a silver lining, the fact that 3/4 of you do believe that will help encourage a greater degree of bipartisan effort in Washington, D.C. than would have been the case had we talked at the beginning of the week. Well, I find that very, very encouraging. So let's talk just briefly for a couple minutes, since we've talked a lot about what happened yesterday, let's talk a little bit about what happened Tuesday in Georgia. And then once we get to the bottom of the hour, as always, we'll switch to your questions. And Jessica will join me, and I'll do my best to answer as many of them as possible over the last 30 minutes. All right, so what do we know about Tuesday? We all know that the fact that Democrats won both of those Senate races means that for all practical purposes, the Democrats now have a majority not just in the House of Representatives, but in the United States Senate, although it will require Vice President Kamala Harris to spend a measurable portion of her life traveling up and down Pennsylvania Avenue in order to break 50-50 ties on any number of votes. There's a school of thought that's emerged that argues that the Democratic majority is actually not going to make that much of a difference. Because the argument goes, it takes 60 votes to pass most things in the Senate. And if Republicans do want to slow down or even stop Biden's agenda, they'll be in a position to. And there is something to that. Had Republicans won at least one of those two Senate races, then Susan Collins, the moderate Republican senator from Maine, would have been the most important person in the U.S. Capitol, because she would have been the deciding vote on most critical pieces of legislation. Now, because the Democrats have 50 seats rather than 49, Joe Manchin, the moderate Democratic senator from West Virginia, becomes the most important person in the Capitol. And the ideological difference between Collins and Manchin is not all that considerable. And either way, 51 votes, even with Harris, is a long way from 60. But there's a few reasons, well, there's a number of reasons, but there's a few I'll concentrate on right now to tell you, that, to express to you why I think the Tuesday outcome and the Democratic Senate majority is so important. Number one, even if the Democrats only hold the majority in the Senate by that one single vote, even though they need Vice President Harris to break a tie, that means that any piece of legislation that President Biden wants the Senate to consider will be raised. Had McConnell been able to maintain his majority leader position, then perhaps that's something that would have. I'm seeing breaking news right now. Nancy Pelosi saying Congress will impeach if the 25th Amendment is not invoked. Obviously, I don't have any more information on that, but for those of you who are watching me rather than CNN, I'd ask that you stick around for another 32 minutes, and then we can all find out what happened next. But I did want to give you that breaking news. And I think for those of you who thought that impeachment of the 25th Amendment was likely, my guess is those numbers probably have grown in the last minute or two. Let's talk for just another minute or two about the Senate, and then we will go to your questions. So the fact that Democratic Majority Leader Chuck Schumer can bring any bill that Joe Biden wants to the floor is an immense advantage for Biden. Because even if Mitch McConnell, as Majority Leader, was disposed to work with Biden on some things, he would still maintain the power not to bring bills to the floor should he choose not to. Now, given the two Democratic wins in Georgia, any bill Biden wants to be considered by Congress automatically will be. And forcing members of both parties, particularly of the minority party, to be on record is something that's a tremendous advantage for him. The other reason that a Democratic majority is so important is it allows the Democrats to use a process called reconciliation on budget and tax matters. And as many of you know, while it does take 60 votes to break a filibuster in the Senate, if a majority of the Senate, if 51 senators vote for reconciliation, that means that you can pass budget and tax votes with a simple majority rather than 60%. So anything budget related, anything tax related, anything related to the economic aspects of COVID, Biden will now be able to pass with 51 rather than 60 votes. I suspect that, I believe very strongly, that Biden will now be able to have his entire cabinet confirmed without any problem whatsoever. There were some concerns raised about Javier Becerra, the designee for the Secretary of Health and Human Services. There were some concerns raised about whether Neera Tanden, Biden's selection to be head of the Office of Management and Budget, whether they would be able to attract sufficient Republican votes to get confirmed, that's no longer a question. Biden will get his entire cabinet in. He will be able to confirm just about any judge that he wants. And while there may be some second or third level appointments that more moderate Democrats express some disappointment on and vote against him on, almost every Biden appointment will now be confirmed given that Democratic majority. On legislation, on policy, it gets a little bit trickier. And we'll talk much more about this next week when we talk as one of our 3 topics about the Biden legislative agenda and how the Democratic majorities in Congress will affect or not affect its passage. But for right now, let's just get to 2 last questions, Claire, if we can, to get your thoughts. We'll use these as a lead into next week's conversation. First question, will a new COVID relief package pass Congress in Biden's first 100 days in office, given that Democratic majority? Do you think that, yes, Biden will pass a major package? Do you think that he'll pass a COVID relief package, but it'll be pretty small, not as broad as perhaps he and many of his allies would like? Or alternatively, do you say, no, the gridlock's just going to be too much for Biden to get passed? What do we think? What are your answers here? 81% say Biden will pass a major package. And we will talk about this more next week, but I'll define a major package, among other things, as a package that includes that additional $2,000 per person stimulus that was the subject of the fight in Congress just before the end of the calendar year. And let's go on to the 5th question, Claire, and then we'll open it up to the audience's questions. This is a little bit trickier because there are moderates in both parties who aren't as predictable on climate change matters as they might be on COVID, as they might be on taxes. So my question to you here is, will Biden be able to pass a climate change bill in his first year in office? Yes, a pretty big and a pretty major sweeping bill. Yeah, but something pretty small and pretty piecemeal. Or no, there's just going to be too much gridlock in Washington. He's not going to be able to do it. So what does our group think? Well, a little bit less optimistic on climate change than on COVID relief. 31%, roughly a third, think it'll be a major package. 57%, more than half, say that some climate change legislation will pass, but it won't be all that big or sweeping. And only 12% say no, nothing, that the gridlock's too much. And we will talk about this more next week, but I do agree with the 57% on that last question, because I think where there is the potential for bipartisan cooperation on climate change relief is on investment, investing government money into emerging green technologies, further investment into solar, into wind, into biofuels, into those type of topics. I suspect you will see a lot of Republican cooperation on that end of the climate change discussion. But given the fact that even with the majority in Congress, there are a fairly good-sized number of more centrist, more moderate Democrats, my guess is the regulatory end of the climate change agenda will be a greater challenge for Biden, as centrist Democrats, having voted for greater investment in green technology and alternative energies, might be a little bit less willing to impose what they would believe would be overly onerous regulations on business, particularly during a time of economic difficulty. All right, so we've gone a little bit long today, but I feel like we've barely scratched the surface on either of these 2 major issues. So hopefully if Jessica can join me and the rest of you can join me as well with your questions, we'll dig deeper for the next 25 minutes. And then of course, we'll come back to both of these topics next week and continue to explore them throughout the year. Hi, Jessica. Happy New Year.
Happy New Year to you too. I guess we can only go up from here, right? All right. First question, are you surprised by how long it took to get to the moment we saw yesterday?
Am I surprised that it took as long that we got, as I assume the question is implying, to a level of such violence, particularly in the Capitol? And I am not surprised. I feel like this has been a gradual ascension of anger and vitriol over a long, long time period. And when, as we talked in December, we outlined the red letter dates between Election Day and Inauguration Day, The date we've been talking about ever since early November, as many of you may remember, as many of you regular participants remember, is we've been talking about the importance of January 6th. And we've been talking about how, while it will not be possible for Trump's allies to prevent Congress from overturning the will of the people in the Electoral College, they will be in a position to delay it. And as that date drew closer, and as Trump's language became more and more incendiary, the greater the concern came that this would reach a breaking point, that even more than all the other very difficult imagery we've seen over recent weeks and over recent years, the January 6th did look like a breaking point. And while I don't think anybody could have predicted the precise nature of it, in retrospect, it's probably not surprising that the day that Congress actually finalized the election results would be a day of explosive and disturbing activity.
Several are also asking about the poor law enforcement reaction to the insurrection yesterday. I think we had about 20 questions on that. So can you talk about the double standard that we saw compared to the protests over the summer during the BLM protests? Can you provide any updates or insight you have about the response of the Capitol Police?
Well, it's very clear that there's going to be a congressional investigation. That's already been promised, and we've heard from members in both parties that they felt that the Capitol Police did not handle the challenge the way that they could have or should have. My natural default, for those of you who've been participating in these programs over the course of the last several months, is my natural instinct is to lean toward a belief in incompetency rather than malice. So my initial reaction is that the Capitol Police were simply not prepared for the challenge with which they were ultimately confronted. And while I'm not defending that lack of preparation, it's understandable, because it would have been hard to predict that the President of the United States would not only use inflammatory language, but actively provoke his supporters to go to the Capitol to engage in this kind of behavior. But whether you find that understandable or not, it's clearly not defensible. And either way, there will be and should be a very detailed investigation of what the Capitol Police did and didn't do, how they did prepare and how they didn't prepare, whether they had the sufficient numbers on hand, whether they had the right kind of equipment available to them. The answers to those as of this morning look like a decidedly no. But what we probably will find out as these hearings and investigations proceed in the months ahead is we'll learn not only about the lack of preparation, we'll learn about whether it was something that was done as a result of just incompetence and ill preparation, or something more purposeful. So we don't know yet, but we will find out.
We also have a lot of questions coming in about the future of the GOP. Someone says, it seems to me that yesterday put the kibosh not only on Donald Trump's further ambitions, but also those of Ted Cruz and Josh Hawley. And then somebody else also asked, what is the future of an openly split GOP?
Boy, this is probably a full topic for us to consider, if not next week, sometime in the next few weeks, Jessica. Because for years and years and years, people have asked me what I thought the prospects were for a viable third party in national politics. And I've always been very dismissive of that for reasons that we can talk about next week or in the weeks ahead. But for the first time in my adult life, I actually do see a three-party structure as opposed to a two-party structure as a real possibility. Because even before yesterday's events, it was very clear that Trump had split the Republican Party in two. And in his ongoing demands for loyalty, in response to his ongoing demands for loyalty, Republican elected officials, and for that matter, Republican voters, were dividing in a more and more pronounced manner. And so we've talked before about pro-Trumpers on one hand, and what I like to call pre-Trumpers on the other. Pre-Trumpers being more traditional Republican conservatives. But even before yesterday's events, as Trump continued to demand loyalty from members of Congress on the votes that were scheduled for yesterday, it became very clear that the party was splitting in two. And it's becoming harder and harder to see how a party with not just Mitt Romney and Susan Collins, but with Ben Sasse and Mitch McConnell and John Thune can continue to exist underneath even a very, very big tent with a Hawley, a Ted Cruz, a Donald Trump Jr. party. I've believed for a long time now that the fight for control of the post-Trump Republican Party between the pre-Trumpers and the pro-Trumpers would go on for a long, long time. But I'm wondering now if after yesterday that we might actually see them split. And even very, very conservative Republicans who could not countenance Trump's behavior decide that being in the same party with those who stuck with Trump all the way to the very bitter end just simply can't coexist under the same tent anymore. Hawley seems to believe that he was harmed by yesterday's activity, rightly so. Just his body language and his demeanor when he was addressing the Senate last night after the violence showed how shaken he was. Senator Tom Cotton from Arkansas, who's also been a very, very ardent and very, very committed supporter of the president, did not vote for the challenges yesterday. And in fact, was very vocal and very harshly critical of both Josh Hawley and Ted Cruz in his public comments. So the early dynamic seems to be away from the Trump loyalists toward a more traditional conservative branch of the party. But that coexistence is going to be a great challenge. And I can't say with any confidence that it will happen.
Thank you. Some are saying what happened yesterday is the beginning of the end of the Trump era, and others are saying this is the end of the beginning of a revolt from Trump supporters. Which argument do you think holds more ground?
Boy, there's two questions that I think have to be answered before we can satisfactorily decide which of those two paths is ahead of us. I think one, given the news that we've just learned about Speaker Pelosi, the fact that the Democrats will pursue impeachment if the cabinet does not act on the 25th Amendment, I think could make it much, much harder for a pro-Trump, a virulent and sometimes violent pro-Trump faction to step aside, both for the next 13 days and going forward. So I'm not arguing against either the 25th Amendment being invoked or against impeachment proceedings. But I do think if either one of those things happened, even a small subset of very, very angry Trump loyalists could cause some real trouble going forward. Again, I want to emphasize, I'm not suggesting that that's a reason to avoid taking those constitutional steps if you happen to think one or the other or both are appropriate. But I think it is worth noting that the most devoted of and angry of Trump loyalists would take either of those as an additional call to arms. More broadly, though, I think one of the things we learned yesterday is a few thousand people in the U.S. Capitol notwithstanding, and a certain number of votes in the U.S. Congress notwithstanding, it appears to me much more than it did 2 days ago that Donald Trump's hold on the Republican Party after he leaves office is going to be a lot weaker than many of us thought it would be. And Trump already, to some degree by his own doing, but to a large degree by Mike Pence, by Mitch McConnell, by others who stayed very, very loyal to him over the years. Donald Trump was marginalized yesterday. And if he was marginalized during such a critical day in American history, even with only 2 weeks left in his term, it becomes easier to see how his influence fades once he has officially left office. I recognize that I'm not answering the question, but I'll feel much better answering it a week from now and certainly 2 weeks from now.
I'll save it so we can ask it again in a couple of weeks. Going back to some of the references you made to previous incidents, What happened to the perpetrators in those previous incidents you mentioned of violence against governments? And what is the appropriate action to take regarding the perpetrators in and out of the government?
Well, in each of the previous instances I mentioned, the perpetrators were tried and convicted. And it's worth noting that not only have leading Democrats and Republicans in Congress vowed to pursue criminal charges against the rioters from yesterday, but this morning, the acting Attorney General, Bill Barr's replacement, Jeffrey Rosen, made a similar public comment. And he made it clear that for his next 2 weeks, he would cooperate fully with law enforcement at every level to make sure that appropriate investigations and charges and proceedings went forward. So I think given the very strong bipartisan mood in the country that we've been talking about now, is that those yesterday who engaged in any violence whatsoever will face very severe criminal charges.
What impact would congressional censure have on Trump's future involvement in a U.S. federal office? Would that effectively have any impact on his continuing impact on the Republican Party and his 2024 candidacy?
Well, very simply put, if Trump is impeached, even if he were to be forced from office 1 hour before Joe Biden's official swearing in at noon on January 20th, if Trump is impeached and removed from office, he is then ineligible to run for president again in the future. Obviously, as we all know, there's been no shortage of speculation over the last couple months about whether Trump would run again, whether he is serious about running 4 years from now, or whether he's simply using that as a fundraising and political tool. Make no mistake, if he were impeached, he would not be eligible to run again. And so that would be the end of that.
Do you think Facebook and Twitter's decision to cut off the president's access to his social media accounts will help reduce tensions and violence and ease the way to a peaceful transfer of power? Or will it have the opposite effect, fueling his supporters' argument that he is treated unfairly by big tech and the deep state and deepen the divisions?
Well, first we should agree that while Twitter and Facebook's decisions to ban Trump, Twitter temporarily, Facebook, it now appears, for the foreseeable future, certainly through January 20th, if not beyond, while those are very, very important steps, it's putting even more import on social media to suggest that they're seminal steps. In other words, there's going to be many, many things that happen in this country over the next 13 days and beyond that will determine whether the president's supporters stick with him or not. I think Facebook and Twitter's decisions to remove him to freeze his account will contribute to that dynamic. But I wouldn't suggest for a minute that being banned from Twitter or Facebook is going to be the one thing that that motivates the president's supporters to a greater level of unhappiness and of additional violence. But the premise of the question is right, and so I'm glad the questioner asked it. Just like the 25th Amendment and impeachment would provoke the president's supporters to a much greater degree, so would a continued ban of his from either social network. As many of you may know, there are now conservative social network alternatives to both Twitter and Facebook that more and more people around the country are using. So it wouldn't surprise me to see Donald Trump, either while still in office or after leaving, decide that Twitter and Facebook are unacceptable to him, and that he would instead rely on other social media platforms to get his word out to his strongest supporters.
When do Ossoff and Warnock take their seats? When does power shift in the Senate? When does McConnell cede his office?
So two different answers. David Perdue actually stopped being a senator on Sunday because his 6-year term officially expired, which means that John Ossoff will be sworn in presumably as quickly as possible. It's worth noting that both Warnock and Ossoff appear to have won by more than 0.5% of the vote, which means that their Republican opponents will not be able to call for a recount. Ossoff's race in particular looked very close to see whether he'd be able to meet that threshold or not. But neither Kelly Loeffler or David Perdue will be able to call for a recall in those Georgia races. So Ossoff ought to be sworn in very, very quickly. And while it'll take a few more days before Warnock takes over, given the unique nature of a special election, both should be in office very soon. The question, though, to me, that's more important than which day and which hour Chuck Schumer becomes majority leader and Mitch McConnell becomes minority leader, is how they will work together. Because the last time the Senate was tied 50-50, back in the year 2001, the then party leaders, Trent Lott and Tom Daschle, put together a power sharing arrangement. For the first several months of that congressional session, until Republican Jim Jeffords from Vermont switched parties and became a Democrat, giving the Democrats a majority, for the first several months there was a 50-50 tie, then as now. And in that case, Republican Vice President Dick Cheney was the deciding vote. What Lott did, even though he enjoyed the majority because of the tiebreaker that the vice president brought, is Lott engaged in a power sharing agreement with Daschle, making sure that Daschle had a voice in who the committee chairs would be, and agreeing that there would be an equal number of Republicans and Democrats on each of the committees to reflect the balance in the Senate. We don't know at this point whether Schumer will come to a similar decision or not. As Trent Lott, the former Republican leader, has pointed out, he and Daschle had a much, much better relationship before the 50-50 tie than Schumer and McConnell do. But I think the thing to watch for is how Schumer decides to arrange the Senate in a 50-50 situation, whether it will be a similar power sharing arrangement to the type we saw 20 years ago, or whether it will be a little bit more hardline.
The events of yesterday completely buried the choice of Merrick Garland as Attorney General. Have you any thought about this selection?
Okay. I think the question is a really, really perceptive one. Under any normal circumstances, the president-elect selecting an attorney general would have driven headlines and news pages across the country. Whereas yesterday, it was buried. But even though it didn't get the attention that an appointment like that would normally receive, I think it's a critically important decision on Biden's part. And I think what it signals is that he is less likely to pursue aggressive legal action out of the Justice Department against the Trump administration than might have been the case had one of the other alternatives been named. Garland will receive support from any number of Republicans, ironically enough, who voted against him when Barack Obama nominated him to the US Supreme Court some years ago. There was already some grumbling among the most progressive of Democrats that Garland is too mainstream. But what the suggestion does tell me is that Biden, just as he has pledged more broadly to pursue a more bipartisan centrist approach to governance, is that he looks at his Department of Justice to frame itself in that same context also.
How do the events of yesterday influence our standing within the global community?
Well, that is a full topic for us to consider. And Jessica, we should probably talk about doing that one next week, or at the very latest, the week after next, immediately preceding the inauguration. But there's no question that our international reputation took a huge and horrible hit yesterday. We've seen, not just from China and Russia, but any number of other countries that have historically been problems for the United States, almost gloating about this. We see countries with horrible human rights records of their own making it clear that they don't feel like they should have to follow the guidance they were hearing from the international community, because look at how the United States democracy has deteriorated. And we saw a lot of support, but a lot of concern from our most natural allies. Macron in France, Merkel in Germany, Trudeau in Canada, all expressed their strong support for the American democracy, but you could see their concern. And as we've talked about in the past, over the last few months, a lot of countries that have been very strong and steadfast allies of the United States in the past do see an opportunity to rebuild those relationships under the Biden administration, but recognize that that fix will not happen automatically and immediately. And so, as we talked about at the very beginning of today's program, that rebuilding and repair process is going to be a long and challenging one. And while the Capitol held and while our democracy held, great damage has been done, and the fixes aren't going to come to either overnight.
Thank you. I was thinking yesterday about all these other protests we've been observing abroad too, with the Gilets jaunes in France, the protests in Hong Kong, and then even a few years back with the Sunflower Movement when they took over the Legislative Yuan, which is essentially the Congress in Taipei. That other countries have more experience with this, but it's obviously not anything that we were anticipating. So interesting topic to explore in the future. Do you think Biden's policies will turn more progressive now that he has Senate and House control, or will he stay true to his message of bridging the divide between the parties?
Well, also a great question. And I think the way to think about Biden's approach going forward is to ask yourself whether you believe that Biden ran as a centrist because he wanted to, or whether he ran as a centrist because he felt he had to. In my own opinion, I could be wrong about this, is that this is genuinely who Biden is. And he did not talk about bipartisanship simply out of partisan and political necessity, but because he honestly believes that that is the appropriate path to govern. Now, will he be able to move on some items that he wouldn't have been able to with the Republican majority? He certainly will. And I suspect COVID and infrastructure and healthcare legislation will all be at least a little bit more left-leaning than it would have been otherwise. But make no mistake about it, whether there's a Democratic or a Republican congressional majority, Joe Biden is not the type of individual who would be calling for a Green New Deal or for Medicare for all, or even for college tuition forgiveness for all, rather than just for those below a certain income level. So I think the Democratic majority in the Senate will facilitate Biden's approach, but I don't think it's going to seriously change it.
And this will be my final question. I know we've taken us right to the end of the hour, and I know we have a lot more to talk about. A few weeks ago on this forum, Congressmember Karen Bass said, "Politics is too important to be left to the politicians," implying that we need to ask more of citizens than just to vote. Whether inside or outside the American political system, is it appropriate to engage in a broad conversation as to what our fundamental obligations are to each other in a civil society?
It is entirely appropriate. And that too is a topic we should address in much more detail than we have time for today, because it's not only an important question, but it's probably the most important question. Representative Bass is exactly right, and I've said the same thing for many, many years. Politics is too important to be left to the politicians. And if our elected representatives, Democrat and Republican, begin to believe that we will have much, much less patience and much, much less tolerance for those who dig in their heels and refuse to work across party lines, natural human instinct and natural political instinct will begin to incentivize a more collegial and more collaborative approach. But that is something that's much easier said than done. And for all of us who've read the news or watched the news over the last several weeks, several months, several years, and become absolutely infuriated with those on the other side, we have to ask ourselves, can we put aside our own fury in order to work with those whom we disagree? And until the answer to that question for all of us is yes, it's probably not fair to ask our elected representatives to do any different or any better.
Thank you so much, Dan. I will turn this back over to Kim and to all of our audience members. I wish you hopefully a better start to the new year than we started. Hopefully it can, like I said, hopefully it can only go up from here. Thank you.
Jessica, thank you so much for handling all of those questions. And Dan, your invaluable and hopeful insights are just what the doctor ordered today. So thank you so very much. And we have great topics for all of your future conversations. Dan's Politics in the Time of Coronavirus will be moving to Tuesdays starting January 19th. That's the week after next. This is in order to accommodate Dan's very vigorous academic and teaching schedule. It'll be at the same time. So next week, Thursday, same time, 11 to 12. And the week after next, make sure you reset your calendars for Tuesdays for Dan's programs. We have a strong lineup of live streams in 2021, and we're very hopeful that we'll be able to start integrating in-person events with our live streams later in the year when it's safe to do so. Please go to our website at lawacth.org to see a terrific lineup of programs starting Monday, a conversation with His Excellency Dr. Mohammed Isa on Islamic faith-based groups and what they are focused on. On Tuesday, we have business strategies for thriving amid global volatility with leadership from the Boston Consulting Group. We have U.S. Congresswoman Barbara Lee next Friday. And February 19th, we've secured Bill Gates to talk about climate change. So please go to our website, register for our programs, become a member, renew your membership, make a donation. Please stay safe, stay informed, and we hope to see you Monday. Dan, thank you again so very much.
Thanks, everybody. We'll look forward to seeing you next week.